Welcome everybody to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status or background. All participants, these are the guidelines for the meeting. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. Please do not unmute or mute yourself. The host will take care of that. To participate in the discussion, please select the raised hand function. You can find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom. The presenters will then call on you and unmute your microphone. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Rosine Foley via the chat box at rfoley, R-F-O-L-E-Y at ctps.org, or by calling 857-702-3704. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Rosine Foley of the MPO staff at rfoley, F-O-L-E-Y, at ctps.org, or call her at 857-702-3704. And please be mindful, we are recording this meeting. I am David Moeller. I represent Secretary Pollock here. Jonathan, you want to call the roll?
Will do. Massdot C2.
John Bouchard here from Massdot.
Thank you. Massdot Highway Division. Okay. Mbta.
Good morning, everyone. Samantha Silverberg, MBTA.
Thank you. Massachusetts Port Authority. Okay. Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Good morning. This is Eric Barassa with MAPC.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Morning, Brian Kane, MBTA Advisory Board, present.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Hello, Leonard Diggins, Advisory Council here.
Thank you, Leonard. City of Boston, BTD.
Tom Katz, City of Boston, representing Mayor Martin Walsh. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hello, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA, representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston.
Great. At-large City of Everett.
Jay Monty, representing Mayor DeMaria and the City of Everett.
Great, thank you. At-large City of Newton.
Good morning, David Kozis, at-large City, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller and the City of Newton.
Excellent. At-large Town of Arlington.
Good morning, Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, representing Select Board Chair John Hurd and MPO area towns.
Wonderful. At-large Town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the Town of Brookline.
Thank you. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Tom Bent, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone, City of Somerville, and the Intercore.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Morning, Austin Siganowicz, Town of Acton, representing the Magic Subregion.
Thank you. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Thatcher Keyser, representing Mayor Spicer, Framingham.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Wynn, representing Mayor Cahill, City of Beverly for the North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn.
Good morning. Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin and the North Suburban Planning Council.
Thank you. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland. Okay. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway. Okay, and Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber of Commerce.
Steve Olenoff, representing Trick Subregion, Town of Norwood.
Thank you. And our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
Thank you. Federal Transit Administration. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report. I'd just like to let everybody know that this morning the governor announced that Secretary Pollock is leaving Massdot to assume a position at the Federal Highway Administration as Deputy Administrator, and that Jamie Tesler will be the acting secretary. Jamie is currently the registrar. That will all happen early next week. You can go on now, Jonathan, to Tegan.
Oh. Hold on.
Tegan, it's the Executive Director's report.
Okay, good. I was able to mute myself. Sorry about that, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. We also have, I guess, a few staffing updates. So first of all, in the past, I have already introduced to you the new incoming Deputy Executive Director to the MPO staff via words. She has not been here in person yet until today. So I would love, rather than sort of reemphasize her credibility, her credit, excuse me, her experience, we'll have an email coming out soon, but I would like her at least to just briefly say hello so you can see her face and hear her voice to give a little bit of a face to the name. So if that's okay, Mr. Chair, I'd love Gina just to say hello briefly.
Of course, Gina.
Thank you. Good morning to each of you. I'm Gina Peril, and I'm very glad to have joined the team and to be with you this morning. And I look forward to getting to know this board and learning from you and working with you as we serve the region. So thank you.
Thank you, Gina.
So welcome to Gina, and again, you'll be hearing more from her very soon. In addition, we have another big significant staffing update in a completely different direction, and that is that Scott Peterson, who is a 28-year veteran of CTPS staff to the MPO, is moving on to the next stage of his career. So his last day with us will be Thursday, February 4th. I believe he is here in this meeting today. I will say that Scott in the COVID world has expressed a desire to do sort of direct one-on-one farewells and not have a sort of a virtual event or gathering to celebrate it. And perhaps we can wait until there is a safe time and space to do a gathering in person. So we will be working to congratulate him and on his next stage virtually for now, and hopefully we'll have an in-person celebration later. I do think it's wonderful to highlight that he actually began as an intern for Ctps in 1988. And I believe he was a cartography intern. And then most recently, as you know, before I started, he served as interim co-executive director with Annette Demscher when Carl Quackenbush departed, and before I was brought on. And I would say that his deep and lengthy institutional knowledge and his very deep technical knowledge and his commitment to CTPS was certainly very important to me in my first year at CTPS, and he really helped keep the agency moving successfully along. So we will very much miss him, and I hope you will join me both in congratulating him and telling him that he will be missed.
So Tegan, give us a second, we'll all applaud.
That sounds great.
That's for you, Scott. Go ahead.
It's so inadequate in the virtual forum, we know that, and we'll try to make it up to you, Scott, at another point soon. Okay, so thank you. And in terms of next steps, with a transition of this significance, I'd like to take a step back. So we had recently posted the data strategist position, and we will likely put that on pause and sort of review that position in the context of Scott's departure and our need to recruit to replace that capacity. Clearly with somebody who's a veteran of the organization for that length of time, there's no one-for-one replacement. So we're going to be thinking through how to sort of fill those gaps in our capacity going forward. But we will likely be recruiting very, very soon for another director level position. So please do keep an eye out for that, and send any thoughts or ideas if you have them. So that's it on the staffing updates for now. As always, I like to give you a few updates on the outreach that staff has been engaging in. And so a couple things to highlight. Last week, we had another intercore committee transportation meeting, which we hosted, MPO staff hosted in collaboration with MAPC. And so we wanted to thank all of you who attended. It was, again, just a great, very meaningful, I think, and robust conversation about kind of priorities and needs in the region. And we talked about a few things like the trip generation rate study, ideas around the upcoming study related to the future of the curb, phase 2, amongst a number of other topics. So thank you again for your participation, and we will be looking forward to the next meeting in April. And I think some of the topics then we think will be resilience and safety targets. So that was the Intercore Committee Transportation meeting. In addition, Betsy and Kate presented at the Interwest Regional Coordination Council yesterday, I believe, where they discussed the coordinated human services transportation plan and the community connections program and other general MPO activities. In terms of surveys, we recently released a survey for study ideas and technical assistance ideas through the UPWP. So this is a big time for us to generate and bring in tons of ideas from you and from all stakeholders in the region and staff, and then bring that into the UPWP process. If you want to reach out and talk to staff directly about this, please do not hesitate to reach out to Sandy Johnston, and he'll be able to also sort of walk you through and take in your ideas and hear your ideas. Also, we have, sorry, just catching up my notes. We'll be presenting soon in another survey that's went out was about MPO elections. So that survey is something that kind of follows on some of the federal certification recommendations, and it's designed to gather information on how people in the region are aware of and engage in the MPO elections process. And so we will take in feedback from that survey and present it to the MPO in hopes that it'll help the MPO in more effectively engaging and creating representation for municipalities throughout the region. So MAPC and the Mbta advisory board are really leading this effort with MPO staff. So more to come when we get those survey results. Upcoming work, we will be presenting at the next Metro West Regional Collaborative meeting. And again, to talk about UPWP ideas. As discussed previously, we will also be kicking off the Equity Task Force planning meeting. So not the task force itself, but the planning meeting on February 2nd. We'll have more details to come, but we'll bring back what we hear from that group to the MPO. We will also have an upcoming coordination meeting with the Southern UZA, which is made up of Boston Region MPO, the Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District, or SERPED, Old Colony Planning Commission, and we'll be meeting on the 3rd, and we'll discuss a range of items to coordinate amongst the MPOs. And then finally, I'd like you to save the date for a TDM forum that's coming up on February 19th. But again, you'll see emails about these. So those are my general updates and outreach items. Today's agenda, we'll have a few work scopes to talk about. We will talk about the transit asset management target updates. And you'll also hear, I think, a really engaging presentation on the results of the Vision Zero study work that we've done, looking at approaches and case studies and how they're applicable to the Boston region. So I hope that'll be an interesting day for you today. And I'm happy to answer any questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Tegan. Does anyone have any questions for Tegan? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is public comment. Does anyone from the public want to comment at this time? If so, please raise your hand and we will call on you.
Mr. Chair, just before we do that, it looks like Mr. Romano has come from the Highway Division. I was hoping he could introduce himself as part of the role.
Do you guys hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Romano.
Thank you, John. So if there's anybody from the public who would like to comment at this time, please raise your hand. Seeing none, if you want to comment during the meeting, raise your hand and we will call on you. Are there any committee chair updates? Tina Cassidy.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I've been asked to give the update this morning on Administration and Finance Committee meeting that we held. And to date, the A&F committee has typically met once a year, and we had vowed last year to try to meet more frequently. In that light, we had a meeting this morning. Our membership has recently expanded. We've added Len Diggins and Sheila Page to the committee, and they fill out a roster that also includes Ben Muller, Brian Kane, Eric Barassa, and myself. We met this morning. Haral Gandhi, who is the Director of Finance and Operations for CTPS, walked us all through sort of an overview of the CTPS budget development process, and then using projections, budget projections and overhead projections with information available through the end of December of 2020. We did a brief overview and determined that with roughly a little over 50% of the year gone by, the expenses projected to date are a little bit under, maybe 52% time elapsed versus 45 to 47% of expenses having been expended. So the budget is on or under budget slightly in terms of certain aspects of the expenses. And the overhead rate, which was budgeted at 106.0%, is right now a little bit over that at 106.08. And if projected to the end of the fiscal year, could rise again a little bit to 106.91. Not alarming and not altogether unexpected, given the challenges that came with this particular year and a couple of other factors. The next meeting of the committee will be on April 1st, no fooling, at 9 a.m. And we would encourage anybody to join us from either the public or this committee, and we'd love to have you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tina. Any questions for Tina or Tegan since that's budget? Seeing none. Next item on our agenda is
David, you're muted.
Yeah, you muted me accidentally, Jonathan.
I did? I'm sorry.
Yep, that's okay. It's the Regional Transportation Advisory Council report. Lynn? Can you hear me now? Jonathan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can everybody else hear us?
I could hear you, but I wasn't able to unmute myself. I know that's the case, but I wasn't getting the mute signal or the unmute signal, so I was just some technical
Thanks
difficulties.
for waiting for us, Lynn. You're
No
up.
problem. No problem at all. We had a meeting last week, and Kate Victor from Massdot came to talk with us about Shared Streets program, and we've tried to get me, Kate, or someone in a capacity to talk with the advisory council on an annual basis, and Kate was very happy to join us. And Tegan, visited us in another kind of annual tradition to give us a touch base with us, and she talked about a little bit of the history of the MPO, part of the MPO 101, and talked with us about the strategic planning that's going on underway, and also gave us a little preview, not preview, but told us that they are working on the scenario planning and the modeling that's going into that. And I just want to say that I'm gonna miss Scott Peterson. Scott Peterson was always willing to talk with me and answer questions, even when a long time ago. And so you always remember the people who just treat you with a lot of respect and patience. When you're just a plain old resident. So Scott's a great guy. Wish him the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Any questions for Lynn, for the members? Seeing none, the next item on our agenda is an all hazards planning application update. Ariel Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, everyone. My name is Ariel Patterson, and I am a transportation planner on the certification activities team at Ctps. I am here today to present the work scope for the federal fiscal year or FFY 2021 Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP, discrete study, the All Hazards Planning Application Update. The purpose of this study is to update the All Hazards Planning Application, one of the Metropolitan Planning Organization's interactive tools that helps users identify various climate hazards relative to the Boston region MPO area's transportation network. The application was first conceptualized over 10 years ago in the Emergency Evacuation and Hazard Mitigation Mapping Project, funded through the FFY 2010 UPWP. Since then, climate change projections have become more accurate, and some of the information in the existing data layers are outdated. As the field of climate resilient transportation planning continues to evolve, it is essential to incorporate the most up-to-date data sets in the application for better planning practices. An anticipated outcome of this study is a well-designed, user-friendly interactive application based on the existing all hazards planning application that informs users of climate hazards in relation to the transportation network. The revised application could help planners, municipalities, and the general public visualize climate change effects on transportation infrastructure and inform building a more resilient system. Also, MPO staff could use the application for Transportation Improvement Program or TIP project evaluations, especially important given the revised scoring criteria, which place a greater emphasis on resiliency and climate change. It can also be used by staff for MPO work, such as ongoing planning studies and updates to the long-range transportation plan assessment. And finally, this work may provide the basis for future projects at TTPS, either through the LRTP scenario planning process or future UPWP study. The work is intended to complement current resiliency work at TTPS, such as the recent FFY 2020 UPWP study, exploring resilience in MPO-funded corridor and intersection studies. Additionally, this work may complement efforts undertaken at the state level through the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team, or RMAT, collaborative work which MPO staff participate in. In summary, the primary objectives for this project are to update the All Hazards Planning application with the most up-to-date information on a new platform using open or publicly available data, to create a more user-friendly tool by making modifications to some design elements that are consistent with CTPS's other interactive application. And lastly, to examine how the application can complement ongoing work with the state and region, as well as current and future work at CTPS. The All Hazards Planning Application Update is an MPO funded project through the FFY 2021 UPWP. It is a 7-month project with a budget of $29,876. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel. Questions for Ariel from the members? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve as presented today? And please state your name for the record when you make the motions. Eric Barassa.
This is Eric Barassa with MAPC. I make a motion to approve the All Hazards Planning Application Update.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, seconds the motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Kadzis, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Siganowitz,
Siganowicz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser, yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, yes.
and Steve Olenoff.
Steve Olenoff, yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
John. Next item on the agenda is a presentation on mapping major infrastructure transportation projects. Ken?
Good morning, and thank you all. Great to see you all again. Just a little shout out to Scott Peterson. I was here at CTPS when around the time he started, so he's going to sorely be missed. He and I have known each other for a long time, and seeing that he went to school for cartography, he and I always had lots to talk about. Anyways, I'm here today to put forth a work scope for the mapping of major infrastructure transportation projects. Now, we already have what's called a mapping basically a transportation infrastructure timeline, which is essentially a large poster which has a list of dates from 1800 to the current day. And next to each date is all of the major transportation milestones that happened that year. So that would be the opening of a turnpike, the opening of a major highway, the opening of a rail line, a rail trail, a transit service, and so forth, as well as even a list of the major legislation, such as the incorporation of the Mbta, the corporation of Massdot, and so on. Adjacent to this very long list is a map of the map of the MPO with all of these infrastructures mapped, but it's essentially just a static map and a large poster. The plan with this project is to take this and turn it into an online interactive application. So essentially you would have a map. Next, it would be a slider bar with that goes from 1800 to the current day. You can move it up and down yourself with your mouse or use the arrow keys up and down. And as you move and slide through the map will populate with all the transportation milestones. They will appear or disappear because in some cases, some did actually go away since for example, the Old Colony Railroad was first constructed, then it was removed, and then it was brought back. Adjacent to this on the other side of the screen would be a list of the milestones for each year. So when you land on a year, there would be a list and it would be broken out by whether it's highway, transit, rail trail, or legislative. This will not only be an interesting tool, but we didn't want to make something that was just fun, just for people to play around with. No, the goal here is to get people to be kind of like brought to the MPO website and to stay there, because on certain pages, when there are a list of a milestone, there could be a project or a product that the MPO has made that relates to that particular infrastructure milestone. For example, if the Southeast Expressway opened in 1958, there probably was an HOV study produced by the Boston MPO, either currently or in the past, which can be referenced on this particular page. And so the idea is to make it not only interactive and fun, but to kind of bring people in and have them kind of like get more involved in transportation and the MPO and what the MPO does. This is a project on the Unified Planning Work Program. The full cost is exactly $20,000, and it should take 8 months to complete from the day of start. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Questions from the MPO? Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and of course to support something like this, kind of, although we're not asking for approval now just of the project in the MPO. What's the definition of a milestone?
A milestone would be the opening date of a highway or section of interstate. It would be a turnpike. It would be a rail line. It could be a commuter rail line. It could be a transit line. Opening of a rail trail, could be the closing of a rail trail, the closing of a transit line, so the opening, the closing, and also major legislative milestones such as the incorporation of the MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, or the incorporation of the Mbta, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, or the incorporation of Massdot, and so forth. So it's the opening date of when these major infrastructure milestones happened.
I guess we're harkening back to maybe that discussion that we had about major infrastructure projects a few months ago. I guess then the question is like, then what is major? I mean, I guess my question is like, how big does the project have to be before it gets included into the study?
Essentially, it's meant to be something that's more visual. So for example, if a section of highway opened, like for instance, when Interstate I-95 opened, it didn't all open at the same time. It opened in sections. So when a particular section of an interstate opened, that would be populated on the map on its particular date. Or when a commuter rail line opened. So for instance, all the commuter rail lines didn't open on the same day, but the Haverhill line opened on a particular day and the Lowell line opened on a particular day. So each year when these things opened, that's when it would populate. So essentially it's meant to be major. So it's something visual. Now there are things that are very important that are small that actually won't be on the map, but they will be listed in the text portion.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Daniel Umsteds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of questions. This sounds like this is a great project, I'd say, and really interesting. Just a couple of questions. Since you're going back to 1800, I'm curious what you would use for the base map for those older projects, or I wonder if you'd be using any like aerial photography from, I suppose, or the early 20th century, if it's available. So just sort of curious about how that's going to be displayed. And then the other thing is, would you consider including like references to things like urban renewal or things with some of these larger highway projects, sort of, linking to information, not CTPS specific, but maybe historical information about maybe it's universities or something that have information about the impact of highway development as part of just talking about the event or the new opening.
Remind me what the first question was first, because I was trying to answer the second one.
Oh, just the base map that you'd be using for this.
So the base map already exists. The issue with the base map as it is that it has all the information on it, and it's a lot. So the idea is that the map will be broken out so that each event or milestone will be on its own layer, and the program can then just turn that layer on as you go up. So the base map is essentially already there. It just needs to be made into an interactive online form. As far as the second question, we are viewing this as something that is not static. I expect it to be modified and changed over time, and are totally open to the ideas of being able to link to other sources. So for example, when a major transit event happened, like the opening of the southern branch of the Orange Line in 1987, the Southwest Corridor branch of the Orange Line, I don't expect the link to necessarily stay or have a link that will only keep you on the MPO website. It would make sense at that point to send you to the MBTA website if they had any information. We would prefer you stay on the MPO website, but would totally expect and are open to the idea of adding links to other resources that people could certainly use. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions for Ken? Steve Olin?
Yeah, so the MPO has done a number of studies over the years that I don't think you can pinpoint to an individual location, like the rail visiting study that we just had a few years ago. And would those things be referenced there, and how would you find them? So say you knew, like in some year there's some study done, could you use this to find that where that study is?
My plan wasn't to have it be all encompassing. I wasn't expecting everything on the MPO website to be referenced in this tool. It was pretty much going to be where appropriate, but that is still something we have yet to determine as we work on this to figure out where that line would be. Be nice to include as much as possible, but for example, rail vision or something that's more general lends itself to could be a potential issue, because does that mean every time a rail project open, do we put a link to rail vision because it's similar? That is something that has not been determined, but it will be hopefully flushed out as the project moves forward.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve this as presented today by MPO member? And please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
Hello, this is Eric Barassa at MAPC. I make a motion to approve the Mapping Major Infrastructure Transportation Projects work study.
Tina Cassidy.
Yes, and this is Tina Cassidy from the City of Woburn, North Suburban Planning Council. I second that motion.
Motion having been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard, okay, John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kazis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Abstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Chiganowicz, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, City of Beverly, votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy, City of Woburn, votes yes.
Steve Olenoff,
Steve Olenoff, yes.
and I will go back to John Bouchard.
John Bouchard, yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, John. Next item on the agenda is proposed, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay, John. You go either way. Proposed state fiscal year 2021 TAM targets for the Boston region. Michelle Scott.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Scott, a member of MPO staff, and I'll be presenting with David D. Rosette and Jillian Linnell from the Mbta on state fiscal year 21 transit asset management targets. Next slide, please. We'll be covering a lot of information today, but there are three main things I'm hoping you all will take away from the presentation. The first is the purpose. The Federal Transit Administration requires transit agencies and MPOs to set targets for transit asset management, or TAM, performance measures as part of the federal TAM rule. Today we'll be presenting you with a staff recommendation to update the MPO's existing transit asset management targets to reflect transit agency state fiscal year 21 targets, which are based on new data and updated expectations for capital investment. And at the close of the presentation, we'll be requesting that you take a vote on this item. And as part of the presentation, I'll be bringing up the opportunity that comes out of this process for the MPO to consider transit asset management performance as we move forward into the winter and spring, and consider capital programming to be included in the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP. There is a memo to accompany this presentation that's available on the MPO meeting calendar, and during the presentation, I'll describe places where you can follow along. I request, Mr. Chair, that in the interest of time, if members could hold their questions to the end, that would help us a lot. Next slide, please. So to give you a quick overview of what we'll be talking about, I'll give a brief introduction to the MPO's performance-based planning and programming process and some upcoming discussions we'll be having. I'll give a quick overview of transit asset management performance measures. I will then turn things over to David and Jillian to review the MBTA's transit asset management targets. Then I'll briefly discuss the Regional Transit Authority targets that represent those from the Metro West Regional Transit Authority, or MWRTA, and the Cape Ann Transportation Authority, or CATA. Representatives of both agencies are available in the audience today to answer questions you may have. I'll close with some discussion of next steps and those opportunities I just mentioned on the previous slide, and then we can take questions and take up the requested action. Next slide, please. So this slide covers the general areas that are part of federal performance management requirements that have been issued by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And the four broad categories relate to safety, asset condition, system performance, and congestion and air quality. And we'll be focusing most specifically today on that second column in yellow related to transit asset condition and transit asset management. Next slide, please. So some great resources for you to learn more about the MPO's existing performance-based planning and programming process. First is our current Transportation Improvement Program, which reflects federal fiscal years 21 to 25. Chapter 4 of that document is our performance analysis chapter, and it talks a lot about federal requirements the MPO needs to meet, existing performance measures and targets, and descriptions of how projects programmed in this current TIP are expected to help make progress towards those targets. Some complementary information about the Commonwealth's performance measures and related targets, and a lot of really extensive visualizations and discussion is provided in Massdot's tracker reporting and at massdottracker.com. Next slide, please. So some upcoming discussions we'll be having about performance-based planning. Today, as you know, we're talking about transit asset management. Next month, we'll be talking about roadway safety performance targets, and we will ask you to take a vote to approve an updated set of those. And coming in March, we'll be hearing from the transit agencies again about a new topic for us, which relates to transit safety performance. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I just realized I don't have my camera on. Just a second. There we are. Okay. So just some quick overview basics about transit asset management and the related requirements. The purpose of this process, which involves, taking account of asset condition and working towards improving assets according to various performance measures, all serves the purpose of improving transit asset state of good repair to allow for better, safer, more reliable transit service delivery. So to advance this process, transit agencies and state sponsors of smaller transit agencies are responsible for developing transit asset management plans that explain their current asset condition and how they plan to improve upon it. These agencies are required to report asset and inventories and condition information annually to the National Transit Database, or NTD, and these agencies are required to set performance targets annually. MPOs are required to set TAM targets for their respective regions, to consider transit capital programming in the context of TAM performance, and to incorporate TAM information and targets into their planning documents, most specifically the Long Range Transportation Plan and the TIP. Next slide, please. So this diagram outlines kind of the three major steps in performance measure development and target setting. The USDOT is responsible for setting TAM measures. The transit agencies develop targets for relevant assets for these measures. And in our case, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at the targets for the T, MWRTA, and CATA. And our job is to work with these agencies to set targets, or in our case, because we already have targets, to revisit our existing ones to make updates. Next slide, please. So this table covers the four main performance measures and asset categories that are covered by the TAM process. These are a subset of transit systems' overall asset portfolio, and the metrics cover specific aspects for each asset type. And the goal overall is to minimize the percentage of assets that each measure accounts for. Basically, when you see a down arrow on subsequent slides, that means things are moving in the right direction. So the TAM performance measures cover rolling stock or revenue vehicles and equipment or non-revenue service vehicles. And both of these are measured by the percentage of these vehicles that have met or exceeded their useful life benchmark. This is basically an age-based measure where if a vehicle has aged beyond a certain threshold, it's more likely to be out of a state of good repair and beyond its life cycle. For facilities like passenger stations or bus garages, FTA has asked us to look at the percentage of facilities that have a condition relating below 3 on FTA's term scale. And the term scale basically measures the condition of an overall facility, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the best. Finally, there's infrastructure or rail fixed guideway, which is measured by the portion of track segments that are subject to performance or speed restrictions. And this is really capturing how transit state of good repair may affect system performance. And so in the memo, you can kind of follow along as we talk through these various measures on so these are tables 2 through 5 in the memo. Table 2 starts on page 5. That covers rolling stock. Table 3 starts on page 7 and covers equipment. Table 4 starts on page 8 and covers facilities. And Table 5 covers infrastructure and starts on page 9. Next slide, please. So just to give you a brief introduction to the targets themselves, these reflect a 1-year fiscal year time frame. So they're really functioning like a short-term management tool, more like a forecast as opposed to a longer term, more aspirational target. And these are based on the transit agency's assessments of their condition as it stands at the end of the previous federal fiscal year and what their expected capital investment and financial projections will be going forward. Performance with respect to these targets does not result in rewards or penalties for transit agencies, states, or MPOs. So in the set of targets that is included in the memo and that you'll hear about today, MPO staff took targets directly from the various transit agencies, has represented targets for each agency separately, but in some cases has collapsed some categories just to reduce the overall number of targets that are presented. So with that, I'll turn it over to David and Jillian to cover the MBTA's targets. Thank you.
Michelle.
So good morning. My name is David DeRosset, and I'm the Deputy Director of Asset Management for the MBTA. I'm here this morning to present the MBTA's progress on implementing our Transit Asset Management Program. And Jillian Linnell is here to present on the MBTA's FY21 TAM goals. Next slide. So the MBTA Asset Management Program is maturing to become more than just an information management database. Our team is developing relationships across all MBTA departments to create strategic processes for the organization to manage assets from inception to replacement. Therefore, managing every T assets, all of the T's assets, full life cycle. Next slide. By FTA reporting mandate, the MBTA reports on 4 asset categories. As you can see, these categories incorporate many asset types within each category. Each of these asset types is managed down to their appropriate level as determined by the maintenance engineers. Next slide. Per FTA guidance, in 2018, the MBTA published our Transit Asset Management Plan, which led to our Strategic Asset Management Plan development in 2020. Our Strategic Asset Management Plan also incorporates performance strategies from the Transit Safety Plan, which you'll hear about later on in March. The MBTA uses these documents to address the 2019 Capital Needs Assessment and the Safety Review Panel Report. Next slide. The Asset Management Department has been developing the Asset Management Program for a little more than 7 years. This timeline is only a snapshot of the many projects the MBTA is working to implement. As you can see, we are planning to update our TAMP, our Transit Asset Management Plan for FY 2022, and to update our Capital Needs Assessment to inform the FY 22 and FY 23 Capital Improvement Program. Next slide. Asset management has successfully complied with the FTA's Transit Asset Management Rule by meeting the Transit Asset Management Plan development deadline. The MBTA has also completed each of the FTA reporting targets and deadlines. Next slide. Over the next year, asset management will align the Transit Asset Management Plan with the Strategic Asset Management Plan and continue developing our asset inventory, data collection, and asset key performance indicators. Our team is also developing a quality management system and further developing our enterprise asset management application. Next slide. Thank you for your time. And now Jillian will present the MBTA's fiscal year 21 performance targets.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jillian Linnell. I'm with the Capital Planning Department at the MBTA. As Dave just mentioned, I'm going to now shift gears a little bit and talk about the actual performance targets that the MBTA set for fiscal year 21. Next slide, please. I think most of this information has already been covered by Michelle, but just a reminder that each year we are required to report not only the performance measures on the state of asset classes at the end of the fiscal year, so at the end of fiscal year 20, but we're also calculating performance targets, which reflect the projected state of each asset class at the end of fiscal year 21. And we will go through each of these different asset categories in more detail. Next slide, please. So we always like to start off this conversation with the MPO and recap, or at least highlight, a number of the capital projects that are driving our overall asset performance. So going by asset category and starting with rolling stock, there are currently a number of fleet procurements underway that we are expecting to continue to improve the overall performance and asset condition of the MBTA's rolling stock. As you'll see here, the delivery of the Green Line Type 9s will be wrapping up this year, with the remaining 8 Type 9s expected to be in service by the end of fiscal year 21. The Red Line and Orange Line fleet procurement, as I'm sure everyone is aware, is very much underway with vehicles on both fleets coming online and into service. We are also currently in the midst of a van and automobile procurement to replace our paratransit fleet. The MBTA also owns 4 ferry boats, which are currently all rotating through an overhaul program that will continue into fiscal year 22. We are completing this overhaul 1 ferry boat at a time. So you will see the impact in our numbers and calculations. And then on the bus side, we are continuing to make progress in our bus fleet replacement program and are expecting a total of 76 new buses to be delivered this fiscal year. Moving on to the equipment side of things, this category includes all non-revenue vehicles that are owned by the MBTA. In past years, you may recall that we were executing a non-revenue vehicle procurement program. That program has largely completed at this point, and therefore going forward, we don't expect to see a lot of impacts of that program continuing. If anything changes, we will be sure to update it accordingly. Under the facilities program, we are in the midst of a bus facilities modernization program and are in the early design and real estate negotiations for the Quincy bus facility. We have an ongoing project at the Iron Horse Operation Control Center, which is underway and expected to be completed in fiscal year 22. We also have a number of projects underway to improve our parking facilities that were included in our most recent acceleration efforts. And then finally, looking at the infrastructure or track side, as part of the Red Line, Orange Line transformation program, we've worked to replace track in problem areas in order to improve our overall reliability on both of those lines. We're investing in the Blue Line with improvements to the track and tunnel infrastructure. Over last summer, we made significant headway replacing, replacing track along the D branch on the Green Line. And then finally, we've continued to make progress on a number of different projects on the commuter rail right away. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to move quickly through these slides, which I think are largely just repeating what Michelle already covered. But as we move into the specific performance measures for each of the different areas, we have one slide that talks about what is driving behind the measure, the description of it, how we calculate it, and some influencing factors. And then we have another slide for each area that talks about the specific calculation. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. But as a reminder, the revenue vehicle condition is measured as the % of vehicles that are at or beyond their useful life benchmark. Useful life benchmark represents the end of their expected life cycle based on the type and age of the vehicle. And as Michelle already mentioned, a lower percentage for this measure reflects a newer fleet. Next slide, please. So for those of you that have been on the MPO board for a number of years, you may recall this slide framework, but on the left-hand side, you will see the mode and asset type for each of these areas. You'll see the useful life benchmark that the MBTA has set for each asset area. Then the first section reflects how we calculated the fiscal year 20 performance measure, followed by the calculation that we used for the fiscal year 21 performance target, and a quick indication of what that trend looks like. So for the revenue vehicles, this year's results are that the bus, light rail, heavy rail, and commuter rail locomotives, the percentage of those beyond their useful life decreased in fiscal year 20 over fiscal year 2019. This was due primarily to the procurement of a number of different vehicle fleets. The percent of older revenue vehicles in the fleet did not change for vintage trolley, commuter rail coach, ferry, or paratransit minivan vehicles from fiscal year 19 to 20. However, 100% of the paratransit automobile fleet reached or exceeded the 6-year useful life in fiscal year 20. Looking ahead, the targets for fiscal year 21 are lower than fiscal year 20 performance for bus, light rail, heavy rail, and the ride vehicles, indicating again newer fleets, which are all driven by a number of those ongoing procurements that I highlighted earlier. Next slide, please. Moving into equipment or non-revenue vehicles, again, this condition is measured as the percent of non-revenue service vehicles at or beyond their useful life benchmark. Again, the ULB represents the end of their expected life cycle based on the type and age of the vehicle according to FTA standards. A lower percentage for this measure reflects a newer fleet. Next slide, please. So for the non-revenue vehicles, the percent of non-revenue transit and commuter rail vehicles at or beyond their useful life was 21% in fiscal year 20, which is a 5% decrease from fiscal year 19, which is due in part to the retirement of older vehicles. The fiscal year 21 target is 30% of non-revenue vehicles beyond their useful life, as no new vehicles are expected to join the fleet in fiscal year 21. Just a note on non-revenue vehicles, this fleet does include a number of vehicles that are used sparingly and can be well functioning far beyond their useful life benchmarks, such as snow equipment. The non-revenue vehicle program that the MBTA was that wrapped up, we largely focused on replacing the highest impact vehicles, which may not always be the oldest vehicles in the fleet. Next slide, please. Moving to facilities, facility condition, as it's already been described, is the percent of facilities that are ranked below a 3 on the 5-point FTA term scale. Using the scale, a score of 5 indicates excellent condition and 1 indicates poor condition, with a score of 3 indicating adequate condition. The term rating is a composite score generated from an on-site assessment of multiple components. It is not a measure of the safety or operational performance of the asset. Again, a lower percentage for this measure reflects facilities in overall better condition. Next slide, please. The percent of facilities below a 3 on the term scale did not change for any facility type from fiscal year 19 to 20. For our targets for 21 are lower than fiscal year 20 performance for transit and commuter rail passenger and parking facilities, due primarily to parking facility improvements expected from the ongoing acceleration work that I previously talked about. Next slide, please. And finally, looking at the track condition or infrastructure, this measure looks at the percent of track distance with speed restrictions, which are track segments where reduced speeds are required to ensure a safe and comfortable ride. This measure is used as a proxy for track condition, with a lower percentage reflecting tracks in general better condition. Next slide, please. The percent of track distance with speed restrictions decreased for both heavy and light rail in fiscal year 20, which may be due in part to accelerated infrastructure improvements. And then commuter rail track with speed restrictions remained at 1% for fiscal year 19 and 20. Targets for fiscal year 21 are lower than fiscal year 20 performance for light rail track, due again to improvements expected from ongoing track work on the Green Line D branch. Next slide, please. That wraps up the majority of the performance measures and targets. Just a quick note about COVID. As you all know, this has had significant impacts on the MBTA, primarily through drastic declines in MBTA ridership and associated revenue loss that will continue to present an unprecedented challenge for the MBTA in the coming fiscal years. In regards to the impact COVID has had on our capital program, as we developed these targets back in October, we did incorporate any known impacts into our calculations, but at the time, the overall impacts that we were accounting for were very minimal. In regards to the Forging Ahead exercise that the MBTA recently went through, the majority of these decisions were finalized after the fiscal year 21 targets were developed. So those paused projects were not reflected in our calculations. However, as previously presented, the reallocation of federal funds is expected to have a minimal impact on the fiscal year 21 CIP. So we wouldn't actually expect to see a significant impact at this time. With that, I will conclude my presentation, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jillian. Are there questions from MPO staff from either Michelle, David, or Jillian? Steve Olenoff.
I was wondering, the subject of the T's parking garages and how that's rated. First of all, you seem to be mixing parking lots and parking garages together on the one rating. Is that correct?
At the rolled up level, yes.
Yeah. So when you look at this, well, there's obviously been a big problem with maintaining parking garages in the system, and you look at this and there's a small percentage because you're not separating out the parking garages from the parking lots, and it's really hard looking at this. It doesn't seem to represent the problem that the T has in maintaining its parking garages. We know the big repairs that have been needed, and it doesn't seem to be reflected in this.
You're correct. So the way that it's presented here in this presentation reflects how the FTA asks us to just report the different sections of the assets, and they combine those, and we therefore roll it up. But I agree that if you drilled down into the more specific different types of assets within all of these categories, you're going to see different trends based on different assets, based on different programs that the T has been advancing to address those asset concerns. So yes, that is true, and thank you for your feedback.
So these are rated 1 to 5. Where do we find out what 1 to 5 means when it relates to a parking garage? And can we find an individual parking garage and how that's rated? And then I think there's a difference between just rating the condition of a parking garage and asking the question, is regular maintenance being performed on these? Are you, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years or more behind where you just haven't really done any maintenance on these things? Can that kind of information be found from this?
So I will just reference that the last slide in my deck actually broke out what the different 1 through 5 numbers represent. And again, that is an FTA provided term scale that we have just adopted. But Dave, do you want to speak quickly to the maintenance program surrounding how we address our parking assets and specifically the garages?
You're asking me?
Sorry, no.
He's asking Dave.
So yes, so the individual parking garage assessments can be found, or we can produce those. That's how my department is managing and feeding information to Jillian's team to inform CIP programs in the future. We also are maintaining the maintenance records in our enterprise asset management system.
And again,
does that answer your question, Stephen?
Yeah, does this assessment show that you're keeping up with maintenance of the garages on a year-to-year basis? Is that something to tell, or we just have to look at this and see when the rating drops and that maintenance hasn't been keeping up with what it should be.
So the way that the FTA is driving the asset management program is that every 4 years we are required to perform an assessment on each asset, each facility asset. From that, we can see the trend for any maintenance that's performed in between those 4 years. We can also develop which assets we want to focus our attentions on for either maintenance projects or replacement projects or overhaul projects.
And then that overall asset condition does inform the projects that end up getting submitted for consideration into our 5-year capital improvement program. And we do, take that into consideration across all of the different asset types and the needs across all of those as we develop the 5-year CIP.
Yeah, but basically, is there a way to tell, are you keeping up with the maintenance on each individual garage or not? Or can you tell that from this?
From this level, probably not. Do you just want to be able to see that? Like, do you want us to provide that information?
Yeah, I know that there are garages where there is very specific maintenance, yearly maintenance from year to year that's specified, yet is that maintenance being done on a year-to-year basis? And I don't think, that's difficult information to come by.
I can understand that, Stephen, and that's where my department is working to make that, to record that information in a standard that makes it easier for us to provide that on a requested basis.
And we would be happy to follow up directly with you and address any specific concerns about specific parking facilities that you might have in mind. So if you want, we can take that offline after the meeting and help answer any additional questions.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yep, not a problem.
Samantha, do you want to say something? You got your hand up?
Yes. Thank you, David. And I have a helper here, so I might be a little distracted.
Yeah, a very happy helper.
Just a couple things to note. So David and Jillian, thank you. Phenomenal presentation and great work and collaboration. A couple things that may not pop out of the data, but two of the things that the MBTA has really focused on and has applied much of its federal program towards are vehicles, particularly buses. And the progress made on our bus fleet is pretty remarkable. I'm probably going to get the number wrong, but I think we've replaced between 350 and 400 buses over the last 4 years. And that's quite impressive. And then the other item is very much on track. So the last area on infrastructure that Jillian mentioned, you saw some very significant reductions in speed restrictions. So that is, the slowdowns that you experience because of poor track condition, particularly because of the significant shutdowns we did over the summer, as well as some of the ongoing, investment programs. We've dramatically improved track condition, particularly on the Green Line. And again, these are big programs that are very disruptive. And so we so appreciate not just the funding support from the MPO and the MPO members, but also the support from the city of Boston and others to allow us to do these shutdowns, which we know are disruptive, but also permit us to accelerate work. So those are two items. And then Steve, on some of your, your garage questions, I think, speaking to Jillian and Dave specifically will be helpful, but I'll also note that Braintree and Quincy Adams projects are significant investments in our parking assets. And once those are done, that you'll see the condition improve at the aggregate, because again, those are significant investments. And then we are also doing targeted investments in Alewife and 128. So we are aware of the garage condition issues and addressing them within the totality of the entire capital plan, knowing that we have lots of assets that impact lots of people in different ways. So 2 points. One, thank you to the staff and the team for really excellent work. He wants to show you a construction site. Always capital. And thank you to the MPO and MPO members for your support to the T capital program, because we are making significant improvements to condition, and this data, among others, helps us show it in real life. So thank you. Please mute me now. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian King.
I'm not sure how I can possibly compete with Samantha's son.
Don't even try.
Yeah, no. My helper is over here snoring. It's my dog. Want to thank David and Jillian and Michelle, Samantha for this. A few of us were given an opportunity to hear a preview of this yesterday, asked a ton of questions, got great answers from the team. I think it's important to consider where we are today in 2021 compared to where we were even just 5 years ago. None of this information was really available. Speed restrictions, when I was at the T, I used to get them all the time. There were dozens and dozens of speed restrictions on the right of way for both rapid transit, heavy rail, light rail, and commuter rail. This information is allowing the T and its teams to dig to drill down onto those specific issues and target them for funding, target them for action. And that is a huge step in the right direction for this agency, which I think it's fair to say for years, at least a decade, really didn't do this stuff or paid lip service to it instead of actually working on it. So I'm very grateful, not only to Jillian and David and Samantha, but their colleagues across the authority that are doing this stuff every day. I also think it's important to note that while this information might not be perfect or might not be exactly what we want, directionally, it is really good. And we are headed in the right direction. We're not there yet. We're certainly not where we want to be in terms of being able to look at discrete projects and get accurate, up-to-date information. And Steve, I agree with you. That's where we need to get to. I do think, however, that this is how we get there. This is the iterative process. The T right now is meeting the FTA's requirements, but I believe they want to exceed them and give all of us the information that we, as a vested public and funder of some of these projects, want to know and deserve to know. And I'm sure in a couple of years we'll know. So I think this is a very positive step. I would encourage the team as it thinks about its next steps to consider a gap analysis, review, study. We have a sense now of what the gap is. I would love to know how much money would be needed to fill that gap. In the past, the SGR gap has been estimated at several $billions. Love to know directionally where we are. I know the Mass Taxpayers Foundation has done a lot of work on this. My organization has done a lot of work on this. We would like to do more. And this is the sort of information that we need. So this is really very positive. And, David, when the time comes, I hope you'll allow me to make the motion to move on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Other questions? Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just briefly pop in and say that I was with Brian yesterday, and I want to express my appreciation for the early outreach. And I felt that I just had to say something as a member of the Rider Oversight Committee, on the Advisory Council. So I will just repeat what Brian has said if I say anything more. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Any other comments from MPO members at this time? So I see we have to do CADA and MWRTA, but let's take a motion to adopt the Ts first, because I think we should treat these as two separate TAM target adoptions. Can I get a motion in a second to adopt the TAM targets as presented today? Brian Kane.
I'm very happy to make that motion, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Is there a second? Lynn Diggins.
I second.
Thank you. Motion hasn't been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll. Jonathan.
Yes, I'm here. David Moeller.
Yes.
John Bouchard.
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano.
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg.
Enthusiastic, yes.
Eric Barassa. Yes. Brian Kane,
I am also an enthusiastic yes.
okay. Leonard Diggins,
And you have your third enthusiastic yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
I'm told Todd Corain has replaced Heather for Brookline.
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Siganowitz,
Austin Siganowitz, aye.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn Beverly votes yes.
I believe Tina Cassidy has left the meeting. Stephen Olenoff,
Steve Olenoff, yes.
motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, we have an update on the CADA and MWRTA TAM targets. I believe this is Michelle.
Okay, thank you to David and Jillian, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I will touch on the CADA and MWRTA targets. Representatives from both agencies are here to help answer questions, as I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the rolling stock performance and targets for the two agencies. The performance as of the end of fiscal year 20, which is the end of June 2020, and the expected performance target for the end of June 2021. And as I mentioned, you can follow along in tables 2, 3, and 4 in the memo. Those tables show a little bit more information than what's on the slide here, particularly the overall asset inventory and the actual counts of assets that meet the particular criterion. So you can see kind of the number of assets that may be affecting the measure on the screen. So as I mentioned, down arrows indicate things moving in the desired direction. So over the coming year, CADA expects to have a few more of its buses move beyond the useful life benchmark, but to have more of its cutaway vehicles beneath that benchmark. For the agency, their two vintage trolley buses are remaining the same. For MWRTA, their automobile and van status is expected to stay the same, but their cutaway vehicles, a few of them are expected to move beyond their useful life benchmark. Next slide, please. So with respect to equipment, a few more of CADA's equipment vehicles are going to be moving beyond their useful life benchmark, while MWRTAs are generally staying the same. One thing I will mention pertaining to the revenue vehicles, there are a number of expected capital purchases for the two agencies that are captured in the fiscal year 21 to 25 tip for bringing new vehicles into those fleets over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. So this captures facilities. CADA and MWRTA each have an administrative facility which has, as in past years, remained in a state of good repair. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to touch on that opportunity item I mentioned on the takeaway slide at the beginning, which really brings us to the question of how do we improve transit assets knowing what we know right now. So a major component of this process is the Massdot Capital Investment Plan, or CIP, which provides funding to both the T and the MWRTA through a series of programs, including those specific to asset management for vehicles and facilities, et cetera, to improve the condition of those assets. And the CIP process is mindful of asset needs as part of sizing those programs. Mbta and Massdot staff also consider asset condition and the potential improvements that a candidate project may make on asset condition when they're scoring projects for inclusion in the CIP. The MPO roles in this process are basically how can we use this information to consider the proposed MBTA and RTA capital programming that's brought to you all later in the spring for inclusion in the upcoming TIP. This process provides some information about where these agencies are with respect to capital condition and what their near-term expected improvement is. And that 5-year TIP process, creates an opportunity for conversation about how to improve those assets over the longer term. And in recent years, the MPO has incorporated a new transit monetization program into its set of investment programs. And this creates an opportunity to talk with these transit agencies and figure out, how MPO resources might be able to help improve transit assets, some of which may affect these TAM measures. Next slide, please. So finally, we completed the first part of the requested action for the MBTA's targets. As staff, I'm now asking the MPO to take up the CADA and MWRTA's targets as well. We're taking care of a lot of this process today, but it's something that, should there be other questions, could carry through till the end of March. And upon approval of the targets, MPO staff will incorporate them into our next TIP and discuss how the investments in transit assets in the TIP will improve performance on these measures over time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Michelle. Any questions from the members for Michelle or the RTAs about the TAM targets? Seeing none, can I get a motion to approve the TAM targets for MWRTA and CADA as presented today? And a second, and please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
Hi, this is Eric Barassa with MAPC. I make a motion to approve the RTA and other TAM targets.
Thank you, Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, I will second Eric's motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis, I'll come back. Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Daniel Amstutz, yes.
Todd Corain,
Todd Corain, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Zaganowitz, aye.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, City of Beverly, votes yes.
and Steve Olenoff.
Steve Olenoff, yes.
Steve Olenoff, yeah. And I'll go back to Tom Kazis.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Michelle. Next item on the agenda is the presentation on the Vision Zero strategies. Sandy Johnston and Paul Christner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe Paul is going to start us off.
Yeah, sorry. Good morning, everyone. I was just trying to get myself unmuted here. So good morning. I'm Paul Christner, Manager of Transit Analysis and Planning, and together with Sandy Johnston, we're going to present the review of Vision Zero policies this morning. As a reminder, this was a federal fiscal year 2020 UPWP study. Many people on the CTPS team contributed to the project, including Matt Archer, Blake Acton, and Bradley Putnam. We performed a literature review and several interviews, and we developed 5 case studies from around the world, about which you can find more detail in the technical memo, and Sandy will speak a little bit about later. Next slide, please. As background, it originated in Sweden in the late 1990s. The goal is that no one shall be killed or seriously injured as a consequence of accidents in road traffic. And the Vision Zero guiding principle is that owners and managers of the system are responsible for the safety of all users. Next slide, please. The Vision Zero Network is an American advocacy group that has developed 5 tenets shown on this slide. They follow Sweden's baseline and highlight elements like preventing death and injury instead of crashes and taking a more systems-based approach as opposed to individual responsibility. Next slide, please. In terms of adoption in the United States, it started to take off in the larger cities in 2014. In early 2014, New York City and San Francisco adopted Vision Zero policies. Both of them had goals of reaching 0 fatalities by 2024. Here in Boston, the Vision Zero policy was adopted in 2016 with a goal of 0 fatalities by 2030. And by 2020, 42 US cities had Vision Zero policies, along with 3 states. Next slide, please. And this map just shows, the map on this slide shows the adoption in the US, and you can see the widespread adoption across the country. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sandy, who'll talk a little bit about case studies and some of the lessons learned.
Thanks, Paul. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this slide shows the 5 case studies we examined in the report, represented by their flags. On the top row, we have the full countries, Sweden and the Netherlands. Left to right on the bottom row, the flags of Helsinki, Finland, Oslo, and Norway, and Portland, Oregon. We're going to share some of the top takeaways that we learned from these case studies. Next slide, please. So one of the most important lessons of Vision Zero is that the entities that own and manage roadways bear a large amount of the responsibility for the safety of road users. This a little bit turns the traditional paradigm that users must look out for themselves and each other on its head. The slide that you see on the screen shows the cycle of responsibility for roadway safety. 2 of the 3 steps are incumbent upon the system designers. For a great example of the paradigm that has been largely dominant in the United States to this point, just this past week, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration put out a letter, which I believe Roisin is going to put in the chat, asking people to essentially drive better in response to escalating road dangers during the pandemic that we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. This is a great example of a paradigm that focuses on users' responsibility for safety while not mentioning that belonging to road managers. In other words, how Vision Zero recommends not framing things. SWOV, the Dutch Traffic Engineering Institute, likes to say that roads should be forgiving. People are fallible and make mistakes, but those mistakes should not be fatal for anyone. And the system should learn from them and continually improve on points of failure. This principle is to this point not especially well established in the US, but that might be changing. In the case of Turturro v. New York City in 2016, the New York State Court of Appeals upheld a jury ruling assigning partial responsibility for injuries sustained by the plaintiff when hit by a car to the city of New York, not just for poor roadway condition, but for the dangerous design of the roadway itself. The design of the roadway encouraged the driver who hit the plaintiff to speed, leaving the city on the hook along with the driver. This is a relatively recent precedent, and the implications are still being played out, but it is something to keep an eye on as it develops. Next slide, please. Vision Zero focuses on a wide range of items and ways of attacking roadway danger, but we found that the most successful Vision Zero programs all heavily emphasize infrastructural interventions. Perhaps the most important principle for infrastructure implementation is that of classifying roads according to their use and linking classification to street design. The slide shows the Dutch classification system, which divides roads into three types: flow, distributor, and access. Flow, or as it's labeled on the slide, through roads, carry traffic at higher speeds between areas. Distributor roads link flow roads to local areas, and access roads serve neighborhoods and local areas, with traffic being carried at low volume and low speed. Every attempt is made to segregate traffic by type so that roads below the flow level do not carry through traffic, and non-motorized road users are not exposed to the high speeds on flow roads. Where necessary, those roads are equipped with separated pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. On local streets, Dutch planners and engineers attempt to control speeds with physical interventions, such as speed humps and chicanes, and try to protect pedestrians by only allowing protected as opposed to permitted left turns, thus attempting to ensure that pedestrians never have to cross more than 2 lanes at a time. Local streets often carry a 20-mile-an-hour, or in Holland, 30 kilometers an hour designation, and are designed for pedestrians, cyclists, and cars to calmly share space. Just want to emphasize again, the key lesson is to align infrastructure with road type, keeping the most vulnerable road users, pedestrians, and people using bikes as the primary concern in every step. Next slide, please. So this slide shows on the left there a typical before and after sequence of a street transformation in Oslo. And you can kind of see how the street has become more multimodal with bike lanes and better accommodations for transit users and the like. Some of the fundamental infrastructure elements that you might see in a street transformation like this include lane narrowing, speed humps, automated speed enforcement, and as mentioned before, protected left turns. It's worth noting with regard to automated speed enforcement, that's currently not legal in Massachusetts. There was a bill that was proposed in the last legislative session to legalize it, but it did not advance. So we will have to see where that goes in the future. It's something to continue monitoring. And we're just going to quickly go through a few other important types of infrastructure investments. Next slide, please. Here we have on the slide an image of a safer pedestrian crossing that's recently been implemented by Massdot at Forest Hills on the Arborway. We're looking east on the Arborway from the crossing of South Street. This was implemented as part of the Casey Overpass Replacement Project. The crossing is marked in green paint for people on bikes, and there's an island in the middle so that pedestrians do not have to cross the entirety of the Arborway, which is a very wide roadway, in one cycle. Next slide, please. This slide shows the steps for converting a signalized intersection into a roundabout from Massdot's Roundabout, a very recent Roundabout guide. This example is from a project on Route 146 in Millbury. Roundabouts are a very popular intervention among places that do a lot of Vision Zero work, and of course, very popular here in Massachusetts as well. Next slide, please. So this slide shows examples of separated bike lanes on the left from Cambridge, on the right from Boston. The Cambridge example shows a bike lane that is at sidewalk level, demonstrating both vertical and horizontal differentiation from the roadway for cars, while the Boston example on the right there is separated from parked cars by a physical buffer and by flex posts, demonstrating horizontal but not vertical separation. Just different ways of achieving that separation. Next slide, please. So in both Sweden and the Netherlands, Vision Zero, or sustainable safety as it's called in the Netherlands, was adopted at all levels of government, working together. In the Netherlands, locally matched federal funding streams implement the plans that are continually being made. We can sometimes contrast that with the situation of occasionally fragmented governance that sometimes applies in the United States. Among our case studies, Portland stands out as an example where fragmented governance of roadways has at least complicated and at worst held up progress in Vision Zero efforts. The Oregon DOT retains authority over speed limit changes and installation over automated enforcement cameras, with the city needing approval from the DOT to implement either of those relatively lightweight interventions. Portland's Vision Zero plan is still relatively young. It's only been around since 2016, but the results thus far appear to be uneven and perhaps not as positive as hoped. It's important to keep in mind that Portland is acting as a municipality, and unlike, for example, one of our other municipal case studies, Helsinki, it does not have full control over all of its roadways. In some circumstances, Portland has had to work with the DOT, as I just mentioned. The Portland plan has been complimented for its equity-focused aspects, but some of the grassroots advocates who helped drive the adoption of that Vision Zero plan in the first place believe that it overemphasizes enforcement. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And finally, results in terms of fatalities have not met the targets that were initially laid out. Acting alone, Portland cannot influence trends in its broader metro area, where at least one investigation has found that roadway fatalities are in fact rising. Next slide, please. Vision Zero emphasizes creating a continual cycle of planning, implementation, review, and recurring improvement. On the slide, we have a graphic demonstrating the way this cycle is supposed to work within the framework of sustainable safety, the Dutch version of Vision Zero. Policy, planning, research, and implementation all combine to create that positive spiral upwards that you see on the slide of continual improvement. In a sense, everything we're talking about in this presentation is part of this cycle. Next slide, please. Perhaps one of the most powerful ways in which sustainable safety creates a positive cycle of change is the continual revision of its guiding principles. These principles have been continually re-examined over the past nearly 30 years. The slide presents 3 columns with the core principles in their 3 revisions, spanning the years 1992 to 2018. The basics remain constant, but additional concerns have been added in as the system managers learn from experience, and there's much more about this in the memo. Next slide, please. Just as an example of the outcomes of that virtuous cycle, the graphic on this slide shows how the city of Helsinki continually lowered speed limits for decades to help achieve better roadway safety outcomes. And this is happening even as actual driving and VMT in Helsinki is tripling over the same time period. Helsinki is a great example of how this cycle works because the brand of Vision Zero or sustainable safety is not actually strong there. Instead, the municipal government incorporates these principles into its regular transportation planning. I'm going to hand it back to Paul for the next few slides.
Thanks, Sandy. Next slide, please. So one of the critical elements of the Vision Zero process, as practiced in successful case studies, is allowing data to drive the process. Portland, for example, places heavy emphasis on its high crash network, an approach inspired by international examples. One of the people we interviewed for this study noted Portland's as a leading adoption of this strategy in the United States. Streets listed in the high crash network represent 8% of streets in Portland, yet account for a disproportionate 57% of deadly crashes. The map on the slide shows how Portland planners enhance the equity aspect of their Vision Zero action plan by overlaying the high crash network on communities of concern, a composite index of 10 equity indicators identified by TriMet, Portland's regional transit provider. The city's stated goal is to complete concept design plans for all high crash network streets by the end of 2021, an early step in creating the virtuous cycle of planning and investment that Sandy just described. Next slide, please. Using data for large-scale tracking is part of the Vision Zero as well. Sustainable Safety in the Netherlands pays careful attention to results over time. One paper estimates that sustainable safety prevented a loss of approximately 1,600 lives between 1998 and 2007, relative to a continuation of prior policies. The slide shows a chart from SWOV, the Dutch Institute for Road Safety Research, tracking estimates that deaths have fallen another 200 per year since then. Notably, serious road injuries have slowly increased over the same time, perhaps suggesting that some crashes that would have previously led to fatalities now cause injury instead. This may be considered progress. It's definitely a desirable trade, but there is an indication that there's significant room remaining for improvement. A last point that we saw in our research is that police crash data is often incomplete. Some locations have developed improved data sets by combining police crash reports with public health and hospital injury data. Next slide, please. One theme that came up in our research is that it's quite timely. The current COVID pandemic offers both illustrative challenges and opportunities. We've seen both here in Massachusetts and nationally that roadway deaths have been level or even increased this year despite major drops in traffic. This appears to be because our roadways are physically designed to allow dangerous speeding. Congestion, which has been largely absent this year, serves as a mitigating factor to speed. The recent court case in New York City that Sandy referenced earlier held that the road owner has some liability for road design that allows for speeding. On the other hand, the emptier streets have built momentum for reallocation of road space from single occupancy vehicle travel to safer, more efficient, or more pleasant uses, ranging from protected bicycle infrastructure to bus lanes or on-street dining. Massdot's Shared Streets grant program has gained national accolades, and several MPO member municipalities have been part of that program or made changes of their own. So both challenges and opportunities as we move into COVID recovery and examine the last year. Next slide, please. Many American municipalities have accomplished some of the initial steps of Vision Zero implementation, including public involvement, education, and outreach. Vision Zero action plans are common documents that outline plans for implementing Vision Zero strategies in the future. The images on this slide show education campaigns from New York City and San Francisco. The image on the left shows a "Was it worth it" image, part of the "Was it worth it" campaign from New York City, encouraging people not to speed through crosswalks and turns. The image on the right is from San Francisco, indicating that just 5 miles over the limit is twice as likely to kill someone. Through their education and outreach campaigns, municipalities should be cognizant of linking transportation improvements to social improvements like better health and more safe mobility options. There should also be recognition of local conditions and communal traumas that should inform public outreach and education campaigns. Now I'm going to hand it back to Sandy to talk about equity and move us into discussion.
Thanks, Paul. So since its inception, the ethos of Vision Zero has been that no one shall be killed or seriously injured as a consequence of accidents in road traffic. Every person deserves the same benefits that Vision Zero provides, including vulnerable and historically marginalized populations. And the first step in providing those benefits is identifying existing disparities. There's significant evidence that major disparities exist in safe pedestrian infrastructure between poorer and wealthier neighborhoods in the US. This slide shows charts from a study by Bridging the Gap, a now defunct research program that was housed at the University of Illinois at Chicago until 2016. They found significant differences. For example, 89% of streets in high-income communities have sidewalks, compared to 49% of streets in low-income communities. And again, you can find much more detail about this and a citation to the actual study in the memo. Next slide, please. The second element of addressing equity in Vision Zero planning is ensuring that plans are implemented equitably. As Vision Zero has become more popular as a concept in the US, some planners and advocates of color and people who work in low-income and minority communities have raised concerns or constructive criticisms about the approach. At the core of many of these critiques is a concern that Vision Zero, as a paradigm that's derived mostly from Northern European experience, sees itself narrowly as a traffic engineering consideration and does not address all of the ways that people, especially those from marginalized or vulnerable communities, might be in danger on the roadways. In the words of one publication, it risks being traffic safety rich and personal safety bankrupt. In particular, Vision Zero has not always intentionally addressed longstanding concerns about structural racism that shape much decision-making, including in the transportation world in the United States. Adonia Lugo, who's an anthropology PhD and a noted bicycle safety activist, has written extensively about this topic, and she's laid out 4 major concerns: dismissal of concerns about the influence of Eurocentric thinking, racial profiling being a street safety afterthought, combative issue framing, and an emphasis on a top-down strategy for culture change. Perhaps the highest profile issue, and one adopted by mainstream Vision Zero activists, is the role of police enforcement in Vision Zero. While a standard, albeit secondary because of its operational cost, part of the Northern European toolkit, aggressive enforcement in the US brings it with it the enhanced risk of police profiling of and violence against people of color. As such, it is precisely the kind of action that might enhance traffic safety, but reduce the personal safety of many Americans. Consequently, many advocates have called for enforcement to be eliminated as a major Vision Zero action item, or at least significantly de-emphasized. And we have on the slide here a picture of some folks from the LA Bike Coalition, which has been a leading advocacy organization on these topics. that was previously led by Tamika Butler, who is, I believe, in the center there. Next slide, please. So that's been a lot of information. We'll be happy to take questions in a moment, but first we want to reiterate what we think of as a couple of the most important lessons from this research, points that play off of each other. First, road owners and managers bear responsibility for the safety of users. Second, governance of Vision Zero must be effectively coordinated between levels of government. And that need, that mission really, is why we have a map of the MPO region up on the slide here. That mission of coordinating planning and implementation between all levels of government, of overcoming the sometimes fragmentation of governance that currently exists in many places, is also the MPO's mission. And in all of the different ways that Vision Zero can play out, we see an opportunity for the MPO to be a resource and a leader in coordinating making our roads safer. That concludes our presentation. I'd like to hand it back to the chair for any discussion.
Thanks, Sandy. Thank you, Paul. Questions from the members? Brian Kane.
Thank you, Sandy, and John. Thank you. Sorry, Paul. You referenced this at the very end of the memo, and I just wanted to encourage you to perhaps follow it up with some further research. The intersection, no pun intended, between Vision Zero and bus lanes, dedicated bus lanes. In many ways, we're trying to make roads wider, but yes, segregate that new space just for T-buses or other buses. That might cut against some of the Vision Zero goals, where we want to narrow roads. And I know this is perhaps not in any of the literature that's out there, at least I haven't seen it, but if it is, please let me know. So I just wanted to encourage you guys as you move forward to consider doing some work on that. I think it's stuff that's going to certainly come up. It is coming up now in many municipal circumstances, and I just wanted to thank you for this, and please keep up the great work. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I will say that's something that has definitely come up in UPWP committee discussions before. There can sometimes be a tension there, and it's something that we'll be considering going forward for sure.
Thank you. Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Sandy and Paul, for the presentation and the information. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I'm looking forward to looking through the memo. A couple of comments or questions, and I guess to piggyback a bit on Brian's comment, I think in a similar vein, trying to accommodate, say, large truck traffic, the sort of challenge between, I think that there's a tension between trying to accommodate that and also doing things like curb bump outs or other sort of street narrowing. And I think that's another factor involved with trying to juggle all different kinds of uses of the street. So that's often come up in my mind in terms of the challenges between pedestrian or bike safety, and then also accommodating large, like 18-wheeler sort of trucks that are using a street. So a comment or a thought, is there, I mean, it looks like you spend most of the research time on there are a number of countries, European countries and so on, but I mean, did you have conversations with Boston, Cambridge, Somerville about some of their lessons learned from trying to implement their Vision Zero programs? There's also a Massachusetts Vision Zero Coalition, which I don't know a whole lot about how that's run exactly, but what did you do, or did you speak to people sort of closer to home in the Boston region that would have a much more context-specific information for the state of Massachusetts?
Paul, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so we did speak to some local folks. I think I'm pretty sure I'm remembering a conversation with Boston, and I know specifically talking about the bus lanes and the truck traffic and thinking about that. I mean, there's definitely those are issues to think about. I know one issue that came up was the issue of speed and how important that is, and lowering the speed of all vehicles, and the fact that we are not legally able to do that in Massachusetts yet. And so some of the municipalities that we talked to were interested to see where that might go. because we don't have the ability to do the automated speed enforcement here, and that's a tool that could help us, and it's also can help address some of the equity concerns as well that Sandy talked about towards the end of the presentation.
Yeah, and I would just add to that in terms of talking to folks, I think that's a kind of next level of research item. This was scoped in kind of intentionally to be about international best practice as well as best practices from around the country. And it was a relatively narrow project with a small budget. So certainly we'd be interested, in pursuing this research on Vision Zero more and more in depth and talking to more of the local stakeholders. But the core mission of this particular research was to bring that international expertise to the MPO in some format.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. And one further comment on the equity, I recently watched some webinars about speed management, and I think one thing to think about as a way, well, I think of to sort of address some of the enforcement issue is to think about these roads as being self-enforcing by using traffic calming and other measures where you don't need to have police to come out and do that type of enforcement. Since I know, at least in Arlington, when it comes to speeding, people are, their main mechanism or way of addressing it is to call the police department and say, can you do some speed enforcement here? And I think the goal should be trying to design the streets so that you don't have to do that, so that actually the enforcement mechanism is the road itself and not the police or the people that are using sort of their discretion about how they enforce that. So thanks.
Yeah,
thanks, Dan.
We definitely saw that in the case studies with the infrastructure interventions being key. Absolutely.
Lynn Diggins. Jonathan, can you unmute Lynn, please? Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. It seems that he's not, it's not undoing it.
All right, then let's go to David Kozis and try to work on Lynn while David's talking. David?
Okay. It's kind of interesting. I'll share, just last night, I was asked to go look at a crosswalk. There was a complaint that the lighting wasn't adequate enough, and so the drivers can't see the pedestrians, right? So I went to visit the site. I saw that the lighting was perfectly fine. We had already bumped out the crosswalks bumped out the sidewalks into the crosswalks. We already added the rapid flashlights. All of the engineering is in place, right, to keep the pedestrians safe. And just in 10 minutes, just standing there, I saw, 2 cars just go straight through. They can't miss the flashing lights. They can't, I just think that sometimes enforcement and I guess education is the only thing left, right? After all the engineering's been done, after everything we can think of is already in place, it was very clear to me that this was an enforcement issue. People are choosing not to stop when, for some reason. And so, I thought it was interesting at the end of the presentation, it was mentioned that sometimes enforcement is not viewed as the best solution, but I think we need to, it's really tricky today. I just think we need to think about that a little bit more. Sometimes I really think it's the only solution that's left besides education.
Thank you, David. So, Lynn, did you still have a comment you wanted to make? And have we figured out how to unmute you? Jonathan, can you get Lynn unmuted?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll go ahead and make my comment, and that was on my end. My microphone had become unplugged, so sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, great report, great tech memorandum. So on the notion of owners and managers becoming more responsible, what does that mean? And what are the legal implications of that?
That's a great question, Len. So the legal implications, as I think we mentioned, are still being played out, right? Like the New York State Court of Appeals is the highest court in New York. Traditionally, it's held a major role in setting legal precedent actually across the country, even though it's not a federal court. But that's the Turturro v. New York case that we mentioned is a relatively recent one, and we'll have to see how it continues to play out. I know there are some people who are busily analyzing that right now. In terms of kind of culture, it really goes back to engineering and implementation of these physical and infrastructural investments. It's, we need to be more aggressively narrowing lanes and separating bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure from cars in the roadway, and doing all this whole laundry list of investments that are mentioned in the memo and that we talked about some of in the presentation. So, there's that, and then there's also just a cultural aspect of it to how agencies that are responsible for roadways behave and how people think of themselves, leaders, elected leaders, and civil servants think of themselves as, in terms of taking responsibility for safety on the roadways. So it's definitely a very large question, and not something that we were able to get into in huge depth in this research.
Thanks, Ed. I am interested in what's going on the state level already, but also I would like to see us take concrete steps towards making this visual zero, because there's a lot here. Integral part of the next LRTP with some milestones in that LRTP spread throughout the next 20 years, because I think without those like concrete steps or really well-defined steps, it remains more a good idea than something that we actually implement. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Ken Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point to some resources that are available from Federal Highway that might be helpful. I'm pretty sure Massdot and MPO staff are aware of them, but we have something called a do-it-yourself local guide for municipalities. It's developing a local road safety plan. And it's a step-by-step process that municipalities and localities can use to develop safety plans for on their own roads. So that's available on the website. I can send Sandy. I don't know if you are aware of it or have the link, but maybe you can send that out to municipalities if you need it. Let me know. Also, just want to point out just one thing in terms of using European cities and countries as models. They have much stricter impaired driving laws than we do in the United States. And so that is probably also a factor in differences between other places in the United States. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken. We did use a number of FHWA's resources in the memo, and they are in fact quite good. So I do recommend them to other folks, and feel free to email me and follow if there's something you'd like us to send out.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Paul. Any other questions from the MPO? Thank you, guys. Great job. Next item is member announcements and items. Are there any? Lynn Diggins.
Thanks. I'm sorry to do this again. This kind of refers back to the seventh item on the agenda, and it's just a question really about the nature of the cooperation between us and other MPOs on that kind of study. It just seems like it's the sort of thing that Massdot would take on for the whole state, and to the extent the MPO is going to do it, it'd be good to see what other MPOs are doing, or at least how we can share what we get out of this with them, because this is something that I think should be done on a statewide level.
Thank you, Lynn. Tegan, can you answer to that? Or can't remember who the presenter was. It's been so long.
It was Ariel.
Thank you, Lynn. Ariel or Tegan, can you answer that question, please?
Ariel, do you want to start? Or do you want me to just step in?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I missed the question. I looked away for 1 second.
No problem. It's mainly a matter of just trying to understand, and this may be even directed towards David too. It's just like, this is an important thing, this hazard planning, and it just seems like something that would be done on a state level, and to the extent it isn't, let's say that we're leading the charge on it, maybe we could find out if other MPOs are doing it, because we have these agreements with the other MPOs, and if that's not the case, are we going to then plan to share what we learn with them so that we can determine these hazards on a statewide basis?
Yeah, I can go. Yeah, thanks for the question, Len. And it's definitely the project, the All Hazards application update. It's really meant to complement the ongoing work at the state and with some like regional organizations like the Mystic River organization. So because the field of climate change and transportation planning is evolving, it's evolving so quickly and moving forward. So we're kind of in step with the state, and Massdot has done like a ton of work, and we meet with them regularly. Ann McGann and I meet with folks from Massdot, from the T, to keep up with what they're doing. And there's a lot of work being done and projects into like 2022, some of like the mapping resources. So the project we have right now with the existing application, like as of this moment, it's meant to complement the state's work and see kind of how we can fit in the whole puzzle piece. But Ann and I have like done a ton of work to like build relationships, and to your point, Len, we want to keep up in this field, and keep moving forward. But as it relates to this project, we just within the capabilities we have, we just have to like update what we have. And as like I talked about, the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team, it's a group, it's like a multi-agency group that was formed in 2016. And they have a couple like very sophisticated tools that eventually we're just starting now to have them lead that effort with a lot of it is like mapping and organize like large scale organizations. So RMAT, it's like an ongoing thing, and they have a long-term plan, but resilientma.org has a ton of great resources through the state, but they definitely have more like sophisticated tools that Ctps, like we can't. I mean, the mapping is like amazing. So.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. That was helpful, and I'm sure I'm looking forward to the technical report or the memo. I'm sure when you do, I'll get to see how it's all integrated in the future plans. So thanks for that late breaking question.
Excellent answer, Ariel. Thank you. Are there other member items or questions at this time? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn this meeting? Please state your name and for the record. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, MAPC. I make a motion to adjourn.
Lynn Diggins.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Without objection, we are adjourned. See everybody in 2 weeks. Bye, guys.